I've just read a rather interesting story about a young man in China who has apparently bought out four cinema screens, four entire cinema screens, to make a point to his ex-girlfriend. According to the report, basically this girl dumped him, I think it was 7 years ago, according to the report, on the grounds that he was poor. At the time, he couldn't even afford money for two cinema tickets, so she dumped him for that. Now, in that time, he's become wealthy, and he's pulled this stunt to try and make a point to his ex-girlfriend. Reading this, a lot of people were sort of laughing about it and thinking, "Oh, the guy's obsessive, etc." Um, I felt a little bit sad because I've had some insight through friends about Chinese culture and the pressure that are on young people when it comes to relationships. Now, on the surface, this guy definitely seems a bit obsessive, and it's certainly a bit of an extreme measure to take. I mean, if she's not interested, he should obviously move on. Um, but I think, from a man's perspective, I also have some sympathy with him, because one of the worst things you can hear from a woman is being seen as weak, financially or otherwise. I don't know the situation, and I don't want to comment too much in their personal situation, but on the outset it would seem that she's very shallow and he's very obsessive. But I think it's important that when we in the West look at cases like this in China, what we're seeing here is sort of the extreme face of Chinese capitalism. Yes, you heard that right, Chinese capitalism. One of the side effects, I think, in my personal opinion, from China developing as a country, and with a much bigger consumer market nowadays, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, and that's certainly something to be welcomed. But there has been a negative side effect to that, which has been a almost Western style, very materialistic culture developing in recent years. It's indisputable, and I think many Chinese would agree with that. Of course, it exists in the West, but it's existed in the West for a long time. This is something relatively new in Chinese culture. Um, anyway, there was a lot of people commenting on the thread, and it bugged me a little bit because they were automatically judging this guy, and automatically mostly judging the guy. Some were judging her as well, but they were sort of calling him names, calling him an obsessive freak and this sort of thing. And I do think his approach was a bit extreme, but what I would like to point out is there's certain social pressures young Chinese people face that are very, very intense. Um, and both men and women face pressures in a different way. I'll try and break this down from my understanding, and I don't claim to be an expert on this, but it's from my insight. There is several big things facing young Chinese. Number one, for young men, there is enormous pressure to be seen to be stable, to have a stable job, to be, if not wealthy, financially stable, well off. The reality is, a young Chinese guy who can't get a job is in a very hard place. I mean, it's hard everywhere in the world, I think, for a young man who's unemployed, because the pressure is immense. Not only is he dealing with the anxiety from having financial insecurity, and bear in mind China is still a developing country, it still hasn't developed a welfare state, so there's not a safety net there. So the pressure is immense, and then he faces social alienation because he's single. It did bug me that a lot of people were sort of gloating about how the guy's obsessive, but I don't think they understood really the sort of pressures that exist in China. I believe it exists all over the world for young men, the need to be seen as financially strong. I mean, basically unemployed men are seen as deadbeats, regardless of their personality, and that's a situation all over the world, and it particularly impacts men in relationships, because men are all over the world, and this may be an effect of patriarchy, but all over the world are expected to be financially strong, or at least the breadwinners. So, especially in countries where there is patriarchy, this is very much the case. It's not like the West where in sort of post-feminist era, women could be businesswomen and that's fine. Of course there are businesswomen in China as well, but the point I'm making is there's much more obvious signs of a patriarchy there, by which I mean there's enormous pressure on young men to be seen to be strong, and it's unfortunate. But it would be wrong to sort of assume that all young Chinese women are shallow gold diggers, although in all honesty, I made another video about this, some of them do come across that way, and some of them are. Let's be blunt about it. Some young Chinese women are very shallow. Some of them are. That's just the reality. But it would be wrong to assume that that's always the case, because there's also huge pressure on young women in Chinese society to get married. 27 is sort of the magic age. It's not that there's any rules about that. It's not like on their 27th birthday they're sort of brought before a panel and said, why are you not married? It's not like that, but it's roughly that age that they would be expected to have got married. In the West, we're a lot more liberal about that sort of thing. No one really cares that much. In China, and I don't know what the situation is in Japan or South Korea, but I'd imagine it's similar. There's enormous pressure on young women to get married. So they therefore need to find a man who's suitable, that their parents would approve of. Now, it's not a case that they have to go with who their parents choose. It's not that conservative. You know, we're not talking about Pakistan here, but it's still pretty conservative in the sense that there is huge expectation and pressure. So the reality is both young men and young women have pressure in China. In the case of young men, there's a huge male surplus. I believe 50 million more men than women. So a lot of young Chinese men literally can't find a bride in some cases. They're not necessarily expected to marry, but they are expected to be financially strong. And young women are expected to get married. And this isn't a culture, by the way, that's very open about homosexuality. It's no longer criminal in China, but it's, let's just say, it's not that liberal about it either. It's sort of, it's legal, but it's not really encouraged. So, yeah, it's just some reflections. I think in one sense we're lucky in the West that we don't have this sort of pressure in relationships. Although having said that, I do think I've been through unemployment, and believe me, it is not good for getting relationships, because women, the reality is, if you're an unemployed man, you can have a heart of gold, you could be a fairly good person, but women won't see you as stable. And I'm not attacking women for that. This isn't intended as sort of a bitter rant. I can understand it. I mean, if I was a woman, I would want to be with someone who makes me feel secure, and if someone's not stable, they couldn't do that. But it's just sad that there is this pressure, and I think I can understand women not wanting to be with men who aren't stable, but I've got very little sympathy for women who look down on men in that position, or who are basically gold diggers. And that's not intended as a sexist remark, it's just a fact. There are women out there who basically will support a man so long as he's rich, and then when he's on hard times she'll fuck off, to put it bluntly. Real women will support their men through thick and thin, just as real men will respect women. It works both ways. So that's just some reflections on this. I'm focused on China just because it is a phenomenon in China, but it's by no means unique. I mean, I think those sort of pressures could be found everywhere, but I just wanted to raise that point because people on the thread were sort of, you know, what the guy had done was a bit extreme and a bit crazy, but I just think it's a byproduct of the sort of pressures that do exist in China.